Today we're talking about floodplain basics, and we do have a Minnesota emphasis there. Some of you might be from other areas, but we will focus on Minnesota specific information. And I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager, and I'll be the main presenter today. And Gary Bennett, who's my coworker, my assistant, he's going to be helping out, watching the chat and helping me with any logistics here as we go forward. So welcome everyone. Please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along. As Gary did mention, in case you didn't hear it, we do plan to send a PDF of the slides to everyone who registered, probably later today, maybe tomorrow. I'll get that out. So starting off with talking about floodplain basics, and we will talk about these main areas, about the National Flood Insurance Program. What is the community role? Who is it that administers floodplain regulations at the local level? Some of our key definitions and terms. Where spatially do floodplain regulations apply? We'll talk at a high level about some of the permitting requirements, how floodplain compares to shoreland management, where we've got some overlap. And as I mentioned, as people were popping in here, we will stick around and answer questions at the end. I probably am not leaving enough Q&A time before 2 o'clock, but because I've got a few too many slides and things to cover, I'm afraid. The law was passed in 1968. I know most of you are probably too young to remember this, but in 1965, there were big floods throughout the country, especially along the Mississippi River. So here in the mid part of the country and affecting many communities. And that was part of the impetus of getting this national program to help reduce future flood risk. And the original program was really focused on 3 areas: identifying those flood-prone areas, and that's the mapping part of the program, having some basic minimum development standards that will be administered locally, and we'll be talking about those regulations, and those are administered through local ordinances, and then also making flood insurance available. It became mandatory in 1973 for properties in the mapped area or for buildings in the mapped area that had federally backed loans, but it was available starting in 1968 or soon after. And a part that got added more like 25 years ago was an emphasis on mitigation and having the county level plans, the mitigation plans, and having grants available to help reduce risk. FEMA calls it their 3-legged stool and the 4-legged stool, with the mitigation being added. At the state level, we needed to adopt enabling legislation. And we did that the next year in 1969. And we had our logo here, 50-year anniversary back in 2019, celebrating the 50 years of our floodplain program and our shoreland management program. The state role is that we are designated as the coordinating agency. We do need to make sure that communities are adopting proper ordinances, and state law actually requires that we approve those ordinances before they're officially effective. And mainly, we're providing technical assistance and giving trainings like this and having educational materials available. We did add our flood hazard mitigation grant program. That was enabled in 1987 by our state legislature. And our state legislature has put a lot of money into that program. And if you've got questions about that, you could be talking with the program lead, Pat Lynch, or Matt Bauman, who's taking over for Pat as he retires here in the near future. But we're going to focus on what you're doing at the local level and what your responsibility is. And this is an old cartoon I've been using for many years. And I know that this is the perception people have, is it seems like there's too many different agencies involved and everybody's pointing at everybody else. But there really are very defined roles and what your role is with the floodplain management. So the first, as I've already been mentioning, is that zoning authority. Whoever the local zoning authority is with the ordinances, those who give out the permits for what you can do locally. And in Minnesota, within cities, they're always the zoning authority. And then the unincorporated parts of the county is usually the zoning authority, although townships are able to be the zoning authority. They have that ability to take that on. And we will be talking about their responsibilities to adopt ordinances and administer the program and keep records. And we really will emphasize keeping records in this presentation. And if you come to our Floodplain Administration 101, talking about the permits and as-builts and the kind of records that you should have on file. As I mentioned, the state, we're not the ones handing out the permits at the local level for what they're doing on the properties. We're there for technical assistance, training. We do have to approve ordinances. We do have staff working with the map updates. We're a cooperating technical partner, so a CTP state, and we do coordinate between FEMA, our mappers, and then also in general, we coordinate with FEMA and help make it so you don't have to talk to FEMA directly and try and understand some of that federal language, the FEMA-ese there. The watersheds in many parts of our state are really key partners, and some will have their own regulations, overlapping regulations, and some do some great mitigation projects and have some great data. FEMA is overseeing things. They're the ones that produce the maps and finalize the maps and enroll communities. As I mentioned, the zoning authority is the community when FEMA's talking about a community. I already mentioned cities, counties, sometimes townships, and then tribal governments would be the zoning authority also. For getting enrolled in the program, they would work directly with FEMA as sovereign nations, but we're happy to help out any of our tribal representatives, staff, and citizens. So when community does get enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program, you're agreeing to administer your floodplain regulations. You do have to enroll that in. You really only have to do that once, so most of you will have enrolled maybe many years ago. If anybody has a question about whether they're enrolled, you can contact us and ask, and I'll be showing another source. You can see whether people are in the program or not. The benefits are that everyone in your community is able to buy flood insurance if they want. It's not just people that are in the mapped areas that can buy flood insurance. Anyone in your community can buy that. And we'll talk about that a couple times here when talking about flood risk and insurance, that about 40% of the claims and the damage that FEMA is seeing is outside of the official mapped areas. So whether it's areas that just didn't get mapped because they're small ponds or low areas, or if they're floods that are bigger than what FEMA maps. For whatever reason, there's a lot of places that are at risk that are not mapped by FEMA. Being participating community also makes some of the disaster assistance available that wouldn't be otherwise, and some of the grants and things like that. But bottom line, it shows that that community cares about their citizens and doing what they can to reduce risk and prevent people from building in places at higher risk. We do have all of our counties with zoning are in the program, and we have many cities, but we do still have a couple hundred cities. Usually they're small ones and don't have a lot of flood risk, but most of our cities with flood risk are in the program. And when you look at the percentage of folks in the state, it is over 96% of people in the state live in a community that participates, and you're able to get flood insurance. FEMA does have something called the Community Status Book. It does show communities alphabetically who are in the program. The other thing it'll show is the current map for that community and when they got enrolled in the program. And you'll see this NSFHA, and you say, what's that mean? Well, it's no special flood hazard area. So there's quite a few cities where FEMA said, we're not mapping this community because there's not much flood risk in that community. So on this list, they'll just say no special flood hazard area, and everything's considered the low risk zone in that community. The other thing you'll see in the enrollment area is sometimes it's got an E for the emergency program. We're down to, maybe a couple dozen communities in that program. And it usually means you've got a map that is either there is no map or it's one of the really earlier emergency type maps. The other thing that's in this list is it'll show over here CRS information, Community Rating System. We won't talk about that today, but there are separate trainings just about the Community Rating System. It is a program FEMA offers where communities can document how they've got higher standards, they're doing a better job of reaching out to folks, they're doing a better job on mitigating current risk and other things like that. And depending on how many points they get in a better class. And in here it shows these couple examples. Montevideo is a class 6, Moorhead's a class 5. Depending on the class, their citizens, if they have flood insurance policies, they get a discount. And class 5, they get a 25% discount. Class 6, they get a 20% discount. And this is actually wrong. FEMA should update this because now they get the same discount in the whole community, whether they're in the special flood hazard area, the mapped area, or not in the special flood hazard area. There is, at the end of this community status book, a list of communities that have mapped risk and that are not in the program. So most of these are smaller communities. And our largest population community on this list would be North Oaks now. International Falls just got enrolled recently. They had been our biggest population community that was on this list. And we do encourage those communities to get enrolled in the program. So we'll be talking about the maps and regulations that apply. There's two main versions of the maps that we'll look at here. This older version is the paper map that we still have in many of our counties, and communities would have had a paper map in the past. And on these paper maps, oops, my arrows are not pointing the right place. That arrow should be pointing to this dark shaded area. So this dark shaded area is the higher risk zone, also known as the 100-year flood area. The medium risk should be pointing to this light gray area. And on some of the newer maps, the medium risk is just these black dots. And on the high risk, it's these aqua colored dots on the panels. And then there's low risk areas where it's not shaded. And we don't call it no risk because there can be risk in those areas. I was mentioning before, about 40% of the claims have been outside of the high risk areas. It's in the high risk area where flood insurance will be mandatory if you've got a federally backed loan and the building's in that area. And this is also where the regulations apply. The medium risk is helpful just to be aware of. That's the 500-year or other medium risk reasons. It can be the 100-year where it's less than a foot deep of flooding, or 100-year where it's draining less than 1 square mile, or where it is protected by an accredited levee or flood control system. And the low risk areas, there could be stormwater ponds, there could be low areas where there's local risk that you might know about, but it didn't get mapped on the FEMA maps. And the more recent maps here, they'll have the aerial background, and the map will be this light blue showing that high flood risk area, and this crosshatch area we'll talk about in a little bit. That's still part of that high risk area. It's actually the highest risk area called the floodway. The medium risk, again, is is usually that 500-year, less than a foot deep 100-year, or draining less than a square mile 100-year, or the areas that are protected by a project. Usually if they're protected by a flood control project, there'll be some cross-hatching here with similar coloring. And again, on the new maps, those lower risk areas don't have any shading. So when FEMA does do the more detailed studies, they usually calculate the 10-year, 50-year, 100-year, and 500-year frequencies. The 100-year is what we're regulating and what the mandatory insurance is based on. But where we have detailed information, we've got this other data that can be used for other purposes. The 10-year we use a lot for the on-site septic system design or for local stormwater management. 50-year is one of the factors for room under bridges with our public water permits for new bridges and culverts. 500 years very helpful for looking at those critical facilities and having some extra safety for some of those things that are more important in when we're building and want to make sure that things are a little bit safer for our community. In the more recent years, those of you who have had updates that started, say, in the last 5 years or so, they've also been calculating the 25-year flood and something called the 100-year plus, which I won't get into here, but just in general, the 100-year, they look at sort of the median of the range when they look at figuring out what that 100-year is, and the 100-year plus is toward the top of that range rather than the middle of that range. So it can be a lot more than the 100-year. Some synonymous terms I've already been using are the 100-year floodplain, the 1% annual chance flood. We don't really like calling it the 100-year flood because people get it in their minds that it only happens literally every 100 years. And people in the Red River of the North area, they had a really big flood in 1997, and the previous flood of record was literally 100 years before, 1897. But we've had a lot of big floods since then. They realize that it doesn't happen every 100 years. But again, it's a statistical probability, and so we'll officially call it the 1% annual chance flood, but we still know people think of it as that 100-year flood once on average every 100 years. FEMA will call that the base flood elevation, and BFE is a term you'll see in a lot of the FEMA information. I already mentioned the special flood hazard area that was on that community status book. Usually when we're talking about special flood hazard area or no special flood hazard area, we're talking about insurance or the loans, though those industries tend to use those terms. And in general, we'll just call it the high flood risk area. So a few definitions here. When the program started and they started mapping out that 100-year floodplain, that 1% annual chance floodplain, people right away said, well, gee, not all of the floodplain has the same kind of risks. If I'm right next to the stream and it's a deep, high velocity floodplain, I'm going to have a lot more risk than someone who's on the very edge of, say, the Mississippi River or some other wide river, the Red River of the North, another good example, where, yeah, I'm going to get wet, but there's probably not a lot of velocity. It's probably more backwater situations. It began with the Flood Insurance Administration, and HUD, but FEMA for most of the years has been mapping what we call the floodway, the area that includes the stream and some of that higher risk area next to the stream versus the flood fringe. And the way they figure that out is they do a model. They had the engineers model what would be the 100-year flood elevation if I've got all the space and I allow the water to go through that entire floodplain. Then they look at, okay, where are we most likely to have the higher risk areas? So in this example, we have a road running along here. There's probably some culverts, so it gets wet over here, but we don't have high velocities. So we might put the edge of our floodway along here. And on this side, the community would be saying, well, gee, we want to be developing here and allowed to fill for development. So we want to leave some of this as flood fringe. So a line's drawn and the engineers rerun the modeling, pretending that all of this area in the flood fringe is filled in, because we're going to allow development to happen in those flood fringe areas. And the floodway has to be left open flood flows. And federally, they say you're squeezing this in and you can't cause more than a foot of surcharge. Because as you take away some of that area for the water to go, what happens to the water that's left in those streams is that the flood elevations get higher. And so from a federal perspective, you can't cause that increase to be more than a foot. In Minnesota, right from the beginning, we said it can be an increase of up to half a foot, but there can't be any increase if it's going to increase flood damage potential, which we interpret as no existing buildings can be touched or impacted. So it would be 0-0 if there's already buildings right next to the floodplain or in the floodplain. You can't make it any worse. But if you're out in a rural area, we wanted some flexibility. So our state law said we're going to allow up to half a foot of increase in areas where there's not buildings impacted. And sometimes they had to go back and forth, a little bit of an iterative process, but this was basically the way that they determined where that floodway was going to be located. Another key term is what is the minimum low floor for new buildings? FEMA says the low floor has to be at least at the base flood elevation, at that 100-year flood elevation. And in Minnesota, right from the beginning, we said, well, gee, we just said it's totally legal to fill in all that flood fringe. It's going to cause up to another half a foot of rise. So that's really what our flood elevation is. So we're going to add that stage increase that we've got due to allowing filling in the flood fringe. And we're going to have a foot of freeboard, a safety factor. And that added together is what we call our regulatory flood protection elevation, or the RFPE. And that is the low floor requirement in Minnesota. For a little while, this freeboard went away, but after the 97 flood, which is a really big flood, our state legislature said, we're making that mandatory. We're paying a lot of money helping communities rebuild. We want to help ensure that they build smart in the future. We want that foot of freeboard applying for everyone. So that freeboard, it accounts for things like the engineers, when they're doing the modeling, they're assuming nice free-flowing waters. There's no ice jams. There's no debris jams. There's no litter in there or pieces of sheds or whatever blocking the culverts and blocking the bridges. Also, there's a certain amount of uncertainty in some parts of the state. We might not have had really good records of precipitation and runoff in the past, and may not have taken into account some of the upstream watershed development. But a big part of it is the debris and ice jams. And here's an example from Benson, Minnesota. We have the main highway right here. We have, just downstream, we've got this railroad crossing. You can see the great big chunks of ice. When I first saw this bridge and saw these things here, the cow catchers is what I call them, we had no idea that there was all these big chunks of ice, but we found out pretty quickly after seeing examples like this why they've got the extra protection on that bridge. And we can see why flood elevations are significantly higher upstream than they are downstream because of the way that this bridge obstructs a lot of the flow there. And also you've got all that ice debris that the modeling doesn't even take into account. So definition of the lowest floor for federal purposes and for your regulations is the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area, including the basement. That includes crawl spaces. That includes whatever you want to call those lower areas, whether you call it a mechanical space, whether it is dirt bottom or a concrete slab, doesn't matter. And it also doesn't matter how high that lowest area is. It doesn't have to be something you can stand up in. It could be just a couple feet deep, or it could be, a full basement or full floor. And it's measured on the walking surface. So the top of the floor, basically, not under supporting pieces of the floor. And basement is an area that is below grade on all sides. So it doesn't matter how deep it is. If we call it a basement or a crawl space, for FEMA regulations, they call it a basement, and they say basements are not allowed for any new buildings or for those additions to buildings. There is an exemption in some of our Red River Valley communities where they're allowed to require dry flood-proof basement and allow basements. But in most of the state, basements are prohibited for residential buildings. For non-residential buildings, we'll get into it a little bit, but they can do the dry flood-proofed basements and use them for limited uses, not for any human habitation purposes. So again, it's any place that's below grade on all sides. So here's an example of a kind of a lookout. Or here, they might call it a utility space and say, oh, that's not a crawl space, it's a utility space. It doesn't matter what you call it, it's below grade, and that's not allowed for any new construction. So take a look at this example here. And let's say that this is the regulatory flood protection elevation. And if this building was in the floodplain, would they be meeting your ordinance if it was a new building? Basically, this is a split level, got to walk out here, but this area is a lookout. And so that would not be compliant if this was in the floodplain. And this house was not in the floodplain. This is my house when we were putting on an addition, but it's a lookout, and if it's in the floodplain, that lowest floor has to meet the minimum elevation. So another one of the requirements here, well, there's a couple things to keep in mind, is that you should not be filling in the floodway when you're putting in buildings. Again, the lowest floor has to be at the regulatory flood protection elevation, which is at least a foot above the base flood elevation with the stage increase. And then for residential properties, you're required to have at least 15 feet of fill out from the building that's at the flood elevation with the stage increase. And it can come straight down and be at that elevation, or come out and have a little retaining wall, but it needs to be at that elevation if it's a basic permitted use.
I see we've got a question in the chat, and maybe you'll get to this later in your presentation, but they ask, how do you determine the floodway elevation / boundary from the old firm maps?
And that gets kind of complicated. On the old maps, you do, if we've got the floodway shown on the maps, there is a flood insurance study that goes with that. And in the flood insurance study, there's a table that says how wide the floodway is. And the floodway is measured. That is not based on an elevation. The floodway is a measured area. So on the newer maps, the digital maps are the official boundaries that you see on those new maps. On the older maps, you have to scale from the center line of the creek or from a street or stuff, things like that. Or again, you can look at what's the width of that floodway and kind of figure out where that is on the ground. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in Wednesday's presentation on FEMA maps and interpreting those maps. But one thing to remember is that the floodway is not based on an elevation. The floodplain is going to be that flood elevation with the stage increase. So the way you can tell the floodway from the flood fringe is purely based on where it shows as the floodway on the FEMA maps. So back to the 15 feet, it's in our older model ordinances, we show that 15-foot requirement for all buildings, but in our current updated model ordinance, we only show that for the residential buildings because state law doesn't actually require it for non-residential buildings or those accessory buildings, just for the residential buildings. And here in this example, here's our regulatory flood protection elevation. And if they're proposing a crawl space like this, What are you going to tell them if they're in the floodplain? You're going to say, nope, you can't do that. Your crawl space has got to meet our RFPE, regulatory flood protection elevation. One other term that people sometimes confuse with our base flood elevation, our high water that we have with the floodplain, is the ordinary high. The ordinary high is a state term. It defines where the boundary of our public waters are. It's defined as where water's been for sufficient period of time to leave evidence on the landscape. Most commonly, that transition between the predominantly terrestrial and predominantly aquatic vegetation. And that, again, is physical evidence. When I was in area hydro, I would go out and look at areas and help people get an idea of where that ordinary high was. You'd look at that physical evidence. You could point on the ground and say, that's where you're about where your ordinary high is. We do official reviews looking at tree evidence and outlets and things like that to determine official ordinary highs, but you could still see about where it was. For the flood elevation, it's usually going to be a couple feet higher, and it's based on how big's that drainage area, what kind of slopes do we have, how many wetlands and ponds are there in the area soaking up some of that water when we have rain, what kind of soils do we have. And so you can't tell just by looking at the area. It is calculated by the engineers. And this is the official definition of an ordinary high, just so you got it in the notes. On water courses, the ordinary high is defined as the top of the bank of the channel. So that is going to vary as you go upstream and downstream. But the 100-year flood is usually in that overbank area, usually includes some of that overbank. So again, it's usually higher unless there was a commissioner's order or something for the ordinary high or some legal case that set that ordinary high. It's extremely rare for the ordinary high to be higher than the 100-year. And again, the ordinary high is based on the physical evidence. It's the official boundary of our public waters. We use it for our shoreland management setbacks, whereas the 100-year, that 1% chance elevation, it's based on engineering modeling and used for our floodplain management. Now, where do the floodplain regulations apply? We will have places, especially those of you with older maps still, where if you look at the official FEMA map, here's an example. This is the official FEMA map on a map that came out in 2015 or 16, shows this. But if you're familiar with the LIDAR, the 2-foot elevation contours, this is showing better data on what the ground elevations are. You can see this is not matching what the ground is in reality. So for this proposed site, they're actually quite high, but they're officially in the FEMA zone. So they still have to show that they're meeting the minimum elevations, but they're going to easily be able to show their lowest floor, even if they have a basement here, is going to be high enough because they're like 20 feet above the flood elevation. And if they wanted to have FEMA say that officially they're not in the floodplain, there's a process called a letter of map amendment. And I know that the house that's really in this spot got a letter of map amendment. Then we've also got houses might be proposed here. And you, as a local official, there's state law that says if there are low areas that are below the base flood elevation adjacent the mapped areas, you're regulating that also. And that makes sense that they're still at risk. In the past, it was hard for local officials to realize they had that situation. They might have known it, but now that we've got LIDAR, we've got this good elevation data, it's very obvious. Oh, this house is low. We want to make sure they're meeting our floodplain regulations. And again, in your ordinance, it will say they must meet that ordinance. The other reminder about where you have to meet minimum elevations is our shoreland management regulations. Again, those were adopted in 1969, same time as our floodplain statutes were adopted, and the rules came out in the early 70s. And basically, within 1,000 feet of lakes and within 300 feet of rivers, or the edge of the floodplain if the floodplain goes out further than 300 feet. That's all part of the shoreland district. And within that distance, you're still required to have minimum elevations, meet the same requirement that is required for floodplain. So even if they're outside of the official floodplain, but they're within that shoreland district, they still, for new buildings and additions, they must meet that minimum elevation. And here's another way to look at it and how to calculate it. What the shoreland rules say is if you know the flood elevation, you use the floodplain ordinance approach of adding a foot to that 100-year flood elevation. That's going to be your minimum elevation. So here's that plus a foot. That's your regulatory flood protection elevation. If you don't have a calculated 100-year, then you use the ordinary high or the highest known water level, whichever is higher, and you add 3 feet to get your lowest floor. So either way, you're requiring a lowest floor there. So I'm going to go through some of the high level requirements for floodplain. And I like this cartoon that was done for the National Association of State Floodplain Managers. Building in a floodplain is like pitching your tent on a highway when there are no cars coming. And this is really showing that nicely. You wouldn't put your tent in the middle of the road. You know the cars are going to come here. And with floodplain, unlike tornadoes and some other kinds of natural disasters, we have a good idea of where the highest likelihood of flooding is because we know elevations. We know we can calculate how much water is coming through those areas. So we want to build smart. Before we had the floodplain information, community might have had a zoning map, their residential and commercial zoning. Along comes the floodplain map, and that gets overlaid on that zoning map. And you're going to be regulating that area with your ordinance. If you've got the detailed area, they've calculated where the floodway is. You've got elevations for the floodplain, for your floodway and your flood fringe. The floodway is going to be like its own zone because we limit uses in the floodway. The underlying zoning would apply in the flood fringe, but in the flood fringe, you'll have some building standards, minimum elevations, and those kinds of things. So again, on the old maps, the floodway is shown here with cross-hatching, or I was showing earlier that you've got the dark shaded areas are the floodplain. And then if there was detailed study, they showed it with the crosshatch in most of the old paper maps. And then on the newer maps, that floodway is shown with this red and blue crosshatching. So again, floodway versus the flood fringe. And in general, in the floodway, we don't allow most types of buildings. The one exception would be with a conditional use permit. A community might put like an open-sided picnic shelter. It has to be something accessory to open space uses and a couple other water-dependent uses like navigation or that's probably the main example. But otherwise, the main things you're looking at in the floodway would be you might be doing some grading for a trail or a road or a parking lot, or you might be putting in a road crossing. And we won't get into the detail today. We get into that in other trainings here, but you must show that whatever you're doing in the floodway, you've got to have an engineer look at where that fill is going, how the dirt's being moved around, that it's not blocking the flows and creating an increase in the flood elevations. It can't cause any increase when there's a mapped floodway. And in the flood fringe, you're going to be looking at what's the underlying zoning, but you're going to have those minimum elevations for that lowest floor. There's some things that are allowed with a conditional use permit, like alternative elevation methods and some types of flood proofing. But in general, it's that lowest floor you're looking at. And if it's an A zone where we don't have a detailed study, we advise that you have to either keep everything out of that floodplain in general, Or if it's on a lake and it's not near a tributary, we will say that you can consider above the ordinary high to be flood fringe and below the ordinary high to be the floodway. Again, if it's not near a conveyance area, it's not on an island out in the middle of the lake or something like that. Watercourses, you're going to treat it as floodway until it's determined otherwise. And we've got a separate training on dealing with A zones, and we talk about a couple techniques you can use that don't involve modeling, but usually it's going to involve modeling to figure out where the floodway versus the flood fringe is. So all development needs a permit. And this comes from the federal regulations, 44 Code of Federal Regulations, the FEMA regulations for any kind of development, and they're very broad on what development involves. It's not just buildings. It's any grading, dredging, filling, paving, any kind of man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. That needs a local permit. And what kind of permit? For buildings, you got building code, then it's going to be a building permit. But otherwise, you might call it a floodplain permit or a zoning permit or a land alteration permit. Any kind of permit works, as long as you're giving some kind of local permit. The one exception would be in our model ordinance, we say if there's a DNR public water work permit for that same project, then you don't need to duplicate efforts and have a separate local permit, because you have an opportunity to comment on the DNR permit. You get a copy of that, so that can count as that local permit. But otherwise, it needs a local permit. You can waive fees or have it really reduce fees if it's something that you wouldn't require a permit for outside of the floodplain. And just a reminder that a local permit is required even if work is in a public water, but it's a situation where a DNR permit's not required. So when are some other times a permit's not required? If it's a tent, it's a temporary structure. You're throwing up tents for a weekend celebration in your community. That doesn't need a floodplain permit. That's a temporary structure. Or recreational vehicles that are travel ready, meaning they have a license to go on the road, they have functioning wheels, they have quick disconnects, they have a way to move off the site when the flood's coming. Now, on the other hand, we do have problems with some of these places that they end up with additions. They even have things going over the RVs. That is not travel ready. Those, if it's essentially being treated like a mobile home or a manufactured home, it has to meet the minimum elevations. Some other examples of when a permit's not needed. FEMA's got some guidance, talks about some routine maintenance. If they're just continuing existing uses, it's farmed and they continue to farm the area, you don't need to give them a permit. Or things that are insignificant, and they give examples such as planting a garden, planting a bush, farming, putting up a mailbox, putting up something similar to a mailbox obstruction like a flagpole, doing a little bit of grading, you topsoil that you can fit in the back of your van, or a little bit of excavation and putting it back at the same grade. That kind of stuff, you could say no permits required. Or a couple more examples would be an in-ground pool would need a permit. But if they're just putting in this temporary little pool, that's something that doesn't need a floodplain permit. Although some local communities do require permits for some of these kinds of pools. And we had an article about this in one of our earlier Water Talk newsletters. But what about fences? They do require permits. And a little bit more about fences. We did get an exemption for farm fences, and that's actually defined in Minnesota statute, defines farm fences. So those that are the poles and some wire are exempt. The farm fences that are more solid walls are not exempt. And here's other examples of fences that would need a permit. Chain link fence, privacy fences need permits. And if they're in a floodway, I mentioned that anything in a floodway, you have to be looking at making sure that they don't cause a rise. And in A zones, we have to make sure that they're not causing more than the allowable rise. And here's an example of a fence. There's the river over here. And actually the picture was being taken because the area hydrologist was documenting an illegal building on the shore here and happened to catch this fence. It had debris from a flood that had come through. Debris caught up in the fence. The current was strong enough, it bent over the fence. But you can see that if there's debris, it can back up the water upstream and impact buildings. So I mentioned that if a DNR permit is issued, then that can count as the permit for that site. But what if in this example, the blue line is public waters. In this part here, we have a FEMA mapped zone, but the public water stops here. If someone's putting in a new crossing here or doing something there, a local permit's needed because there's no DNR permit required because there's not a DNR public water course. The other situations would be if it's draining less than 5 square miles, it doesn't need a DNR permit, or where it's a replacement of the same size and type. They don't need a DNR permit, but they need your local permit to make sure that they're building it the right way. Floodway, again, I mentioned that the main things you're going to be seeing here, this is along a trail along the Mississippi River. You're still seeing damage. So you do still see damage, but we're trying to reduce that in the floodway. Better a light pole being knocked over than someone's house. Getting into the requirements in the flood fringe, things that you could do as permitted uses would be, again, elevating on fill, meeting that lowest floor requirement at the regulatory flood protection elevation. With a CUP, they can do the stilts or a wet flood-proofed lower area that's just allowed for parking or limited storage is another option that's allowed with a CUP. And we talked about these before. Another thing that is allowed in our model ordinance is an accessory structure only if it's for parking and limited storage of things that aren't hazardous, are not pollutants, because that's not allowed in the floodplain. And it's got to be with flood resistant materials up to the regulatory flood protection elevation. The utilities, usually that's electric. If I'm seeing other utilities, I'm concerned that they're actually using it to live in or habitable area. But pretty common in our sheds to see electric. That needs to be above the regulatory flood protection elevation, and the outlets. They've got to be anchored so they don't float downstream and block areas. And they have to have flood openings that are automatic. And that opening is so that as the water builds up on the building, you're not getting pressure on one side. You're equalizing the pressure by opening that up. If you don't have those openings, this is what you see. We have a lot of pictures like this from earlier floods in Minnesota where these are older buildings built before our current requirements, and the pressure built up against those foundations bursts those foundations. The openings do need to be within a foot of the ground or the floor so that you don't build up too much pressure there. And there's other detailed requirements. You can get engineered ones if people don't want to have just the area open. And these are engineered to be the equivalent of a certain opening size and engineered so that when the water pushes against it, they open up. But when people want the areas insulated, they like to get these engineered vents instead of just having the open vents. But there is a document that gives some idea of what's the equivalent opening, because you have to have, for every square foot enclosed, you need a square inch of opening. So 576 square foot shed or garage, you need 576 square inches equivalent of opening in your vents. And 576 square feet might sound like a weird size, but it's basically 24 by 24, what they thought a 2-car garage would be. So a reminder that you need to document when there's, especially for structures, you need to be getting as-built surveys for any new structures, documenting what flood-proof structures are meeting your requirements, and documenting the grading or filling is meeting what they said they were going to do and what it was modeled for. a reminder of that shoreline management program. You're regulating within that 1,000 feet with the shoreline program. The shoreline program is more focused on protecting the habitat and water quality and some aesthetics, whereas floodplain's more on the public safety and protecting those homes and lives, of course, and the most restrictive of lives. So in the floodplain, you can't put buildings in the floodway. In the shoreland, we've got minimum lot sizes, we've got setbacks for the buildings and on-site septic systems. We've got a shore impact area where we minimize the removal of vegetation and things. And we've also got these setbacks that could be different than what you're seeing for floodplain purposes. So you're going to look at whichever's more stringent. Sometimes staying out of the floodway is going to be more stringent, like in this case. And sometimes the shoreland setback will be more stringent. And you're going to go with whichever is more stringent. And I talked earlier about, remember, in the shoreland, we have minimum depths in the entire shoreland district. So I'm down to just a couple minutes left. I'll just say a little bit about flood insurance. And this is a sign the neighbors put up when there's a new development that went into the upper landing in St. Paul. Some of you may know the area I'm talking about. And it is a low area. They did build it legally, but the neighbors who are higher had to comment on, got flood insurance. So a reminder that anyone in a participating community can buy flood insurance, and you can buy it in all the flood zones. And one of the most common myths is agents will tell people they can only get it in the high risk areas. That is not true. The other reminders is that your basic home auto insurance is rarely covering flood damage. And assistance after a flood, you might hear about FEMA out there helping people after floods. Well, they're not out there handing out money to homeowners. Most of the floods don't get declared by FEMA, don't have any help. And those that do get declared by FEMA are usually for public damage, for the roads and road crossings and electric lines and things like that. It's very rare. In Minnesota, in the last 25 years, we've had one disaster declaration for individual assistance where there was any kind of funding that was just grants, that was not a loan. And even then, most of the floods, it's an SBA loan that's got to be paid back. That is the kind of assistance you can get. So again, flood insurance is required if you've got a federally backed loan, you're in the high risk area, and it's not just if part of the property, it's if the building itself is in or touching that area. And again, here, the FEMA mapped area is what they're looking at. This person will be told they have to get flood insurance unless they go through that letter of map amendment process. And have FEMA document that officially they're high and not subject to the mandatory flood insurance. But this person here won't be told based on the current maps, but on future maps where it's mapped more accurately, they will be told they need to get flood insurance. The new flood rating is here. They are looking at rating individually for all properties, no matter whether they're in a mapped area or not. It used to be that they rated differently if you were in the high risk zone versus in the medium or low risk zones. And they used to require an elevation certificate if you were in the mapped area. That's now all the zones are treated the same. They don't require an elevation certificate in the high risk zone or any of the zones, but often they can get you a better rate. And we're down to the end here. I'm not going to get into details, but they are now looking at a lot of other factors. We still have two different parts of the flood insurance. One is for the building itself. That's what's shown covered here in green. And then the contents coverage is a separate part of the flood insurance policy that you have to get separately. And that covers your stuff and the things that are not connected to the building. And things in red, they're not part of the building. Your auto is separate, of course. And the belongings in the basement are not covered in the basement. The things that are covered are like the furnace, water heater, washer, dryer, freezer with food, but not your stuff. And you can get a sewer backup or a rider on your homeowner's insurance, but that's not routine. And I see we're at 2 o'clock. So that is what I had in my presentation. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.